Hey girlies, just a quick reminder before we dive into today's episode. The information shared on this podcast is intended to be general sports nutrition advice and education related to period recovery for female athletes. This is not specific to any one individual, and it may or may not apply to your situation. If you are looking for personalized guidance, be sure to apply to our RBSN Period Recovery Nutrition Coaching Program. Our 4-month period recovery program is designed to help you sustainably get your period back and keep it. You can apply now to get started in our program, and we'll leave the link for the program below. If you're not quite ready for that one-on-one approach, that's exactly why we created the Period Recovery Guide. It's designed to support the girlies working on period recovery, specifically if you've lost it due to hypothalamic amenorrhea. The full guide is coming soon, but you can download a free chapter right now to start your recovery journey. This is the Eat More Carbs Podcast. Hello and welcome back. This is the Eat More Carbs Podcast. It's Jenna here with Reilly. Thank you so much for listening to another episode. Today we're going to be chatting all about Reilly's half marathon experience. She just ran the Rock and Roll half marathon in Washington, D.C. just the other weekend. So she's going to be sharing all about her fueling journey throughout that whole time and her experience and how the race went. I know you kind of shared a little bit of like a tease on your Instagram story. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about how this race played out.
I will say I ran part of the DC Rock and Roll half marathon. We ended up DNFing, unfortunately, because somebody in our party did get injured. But I have lots of really fun and like educational learnings that I gathered from the weekend. So I'm really excited to chat with you all about it today.
We're really excited to hear about the whole experience. Before we get into all about your half marathon, we're going to share our high and low. So the part of our week that went really well and maybe the part of our week that went not great. So Reilly, kick us off. How's your week going?
My week is definitely really interesting. My high and my low are actually one of the same story. To give a little background, the reason that we decided to go up to DC and we chose the Rock and Roll half marathon up there is actually because my sister lives in DC. So we were kind of just using it as an excuse to go up and visit her. So that was kind of the priority of that weekend. On Saturday night, after we completed or ran, I guess you can say, we trotted around DC, we went out to eat with my sister and her boyfriend, and dinner was amazing. It was really good. We went to like a James Beard nominated restaurant, which I know I'm like, this is way too fancy for me. I live in Winston-Salem, but it was really good and it was really fun. When we were at the restaurant, we were talking about what we were going to do next after dinner. My sister said she had reservations for us at this like bar. It was a speakeasy down the street. They specialized in Jello shots. I know, that was my reaction too. And this was probably my low because I remember like looking at my husband, looking at Rob's and looking at my sister being like, we are going to a speakeasy with Jello shots. Like, I am 33. I haven't taken a Jello shot in a very long time. Like, what is happening here? We ended up going to the speakeasy. I'm not a big drinker. I could probably count on one hand how many drinks I've had in 2025, including 2 from this night. We actually had the best Jello shot that I have ever had in my life. And before you pass judgment, hear me out, because what they did is they took different pieces of fruit and they like pureed them with like all these different ingredients. They were super fancy. I can't even remember them, but they would like place the Jello shots like in pieces of fruit. So we got like an orange slice that was like a Jello shot. And then you got like this tiny little glass of champagne. So it was like almost reversed because you usually take the shot and then you chase it like with a piece of fruit. But instead we had a little fruit and then we chased it with champagne.
I knew it had to be something fancy because your sister wasn't going to take you to a place where you're taking like a Jello shot out of like a plastic cup. Like, it's going to be something cool, but that's really cool. I kind of love that. And it's like fruity and fun.
Yeah. So that was kind of my low, is that, you know, I am 33 and I did take a couple Jello shots this past weekend, but they ended up being pretty classy. My sister's very classy. So I had trust in her, but it was just a really interesting but fun experience.
I'm glad you stepped outside of your comfort zone with that and tried something new. So that's fun. Or not, maybe not something new, but definitely a new twist on a potentially something you haven't seen in like decades plus. That's college kind of a thing. So I love that.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just nice to, you know, try new things. What about you, Jenna? What is going on this week?
Well, if you haven't been able to tell from listening to me talk, I'm a little bit under the weather right now. This is just a moment of like vulnerability that I'm going to share. It's going to be like my low into my high. But I think that especially when we're in the middle of training for something or we're really excited excited about our training or something like that, it can be so hard to admit to ourselves that we actually need to stop, take a rest day, take a step back from training, and just accept that like that's what our body is asking for. As I shared on a previous episode, I had been traveling a little bit, so I'm betting that I probably picked something up during my travels. I don't know why the airport and being on a plane is like somehow like the place where everyone who is sick tends to congregate, but it just seems to work out that way. But I was so in denial that I was potentially getting sick that I was telling everyone that I had allergies, which is not so out of the box because sometimes when it does get really windy here in Arizona, like I do get like a runny nose afterwards because there's so much dust in the air. And we had gone running outside and I just was like telling everyone, I was like, yeah, my nose is running. I'm just having the worst allergies. Like we've had rain here, we've had wind here. So I was like, it's just from that. And I was so far in denial that like there was no way that I'd even crossed my mind that I was potentially sick. So I still ran my long run on Friday, and I probably should not have done that, truthfully, because I didn't feel my best during the start of that. And at the end of that, I was like, oh, I don't think this is allergies. And I was finally ready to admit to myself that like I probably was sick. And that meant that I needed to take some time away from running, which is really hard to do when you have a big goal for a marathon and you have a time-based goal and you're maybe following a running plan that says, hey, you have this workout today or something like that. You almost feel guilty if you don't complete it. But I needed to take some time off so that my body could recover. My high is that I am feeling better now. I don't sound great, but I'm feeling much better than I was before. But I couldn't push myself through the weekend and do the things that I had wanted to do in order to keep up with my marathon training, which is coming up pretty quick. Sometimes these things happen and they're out of our control. And it's really hard to admit to ourselves that like we need to take a step back from training. We need to take a pause and we need to take a rest. And that might mean that marathon day looks slightly different than what I had wanted it to, or training looks slightly different than I had wanted it to. But that's part of life. And we have to like understand that what my body was asking for was rest. And there was no way that I should push through the weekend and just continue to run while feeling like this. So low into a high there of feeling sick. We all make that mistake of being like, I got this, I can push through this. But sometimes the best thing for our body truly is rest.
Well, thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing with us. I do remember last week you telling me that you had allergies.
Yeah, I was so deep in denial. I was like, this couldn't be anything but allergies.
I was laughing kind of because I do remember that.
Sometimes we do need to laugh about it because it truly is kind of like, wow, I really had myself fooled in that moment too. And just a reminder that if you are in a position where your body is asking for rest, like it's okay to take some rest and allow your body to recover because that's the best thing for you. But today is all about Reilly's half marathon experience. I'm so excited for you to share a little bit about like your fueling journey through your half marathon, what worked well, what maybe you wish you had done differently, what you might do differently in your next race compared to this one. So tell us about it.
Even though I DNF'd, there was so much valuable insight that I was able to take from this race in preparation for the races I have planned this year, and then eventually the New York Marathon, which I'm super excited for. I would say that my phase 2 of Run a Marathon this year is now activated. I'm going to be working on a lot of like speed work and then also just a lot of like fueling strategies and just, over the next couple of months, really preparing for that marathon. I learned a lot this past weekend because there's so much that you can do at your house, right? Like even if you have a fueling strategy that you have figured out, or you are practicing different fueling strategies, race day just like is different. There's things that come up and you just feel different. You've like deloaded that week. Even though we didn't finish, I learned so much. I think the first big thing that I can take away from this race was this was the first race that I've ever had to travel for. In the past, I lived in California and there's a ton of races in California. So I could drive 45 to 60 minutes away from my home and I was able to participate in a variety of different races. And then, moving back on the East Coast, I was either staying at my parents' house or Rob's, my husband's, his parents' house. And that was a really familiar place. So having to travel for the first time definitely was a new experience.
What did you do in order to help prepare yourself for that travel? Or how did you find that fueling in a hotel the morning of was different from being at your house or being in a familiar home?
I think the biggest thing was like making sure I had prepared from a standpoint of, that week, making sure that I had the right snacks, the right fuel, but then also practicing my fueling ahead of time, making sure that I was waking up at the time that I would be waking up at the hotel, and then also practicing with a variety of different nutrients, a variety of different foods and ingredients so that I was prepared to pack those items come race week.
What did you end up packing for your breakfast or your pre-run fuel?
I ended up packing a like instant oats. We were really restricted on what was available at the hotel, and like the breakfast didn't open until like 7 or 7:30. So there was no way that I was going to be able to like rely on the hotel amenities to fuel myself. And that's actually the approach I took with everything. And the approach I'm going to be taking moving forward with all my races is I'm always going to have like a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. Plan A is to use the fuel that is available at the race or at the amenities. But then plan B is to basically make the assumption that nothing is going to be available. How can I have the right fuel on me? How can I have the right hydration on me? How am I planning and acting like nothing is going to be available? Because sometimes it's not going to be. For example, I had an instant oats. That was my plan A. I knew that breakfast wasn't going to be available, and I knew that there was hot water out at the coffee machine, so I knew that I'd be able to make my oats. What I didn't plan for was that there's not spoons readily available in your hotel room, and this was never even something that crossed my mind. That was my plan A. I was able to get like cutlery from the downstairs reception, but I can't imagine if this was before the New York Marathon and I was like drinking my oats because I was on Staten Island and I didn't have a spoon available. So making sure that I remember that for the future is really important. If I wasn't able to get a spoon, I did have a plan B. I did have my toaster pastries with me. I did have a bagel with me in case I wasn't able to get in my oatmeal, but luckily I was able to find a spoon.
I'm so glad that the hotel at least had a spoon for you, because like as much as we plan and prepare and we have those plan B, plan C options, we want plan A. That's the one we've probably practiced with the most, and there's a reason why it is plan A. So finding a way to make sure that works for you, I'm so glad that that worked out. Tell me a little bit about like other fueling things or things that you brought with you from home to like make that breakfast or make that first fuel of the day more successful for you.
Something that I had noticed when I had been practicing was waking up at like 5:36. It's just really hard for me to eat that early in the morning. Something that I had been practicing with and something that I brought with me was liquid energy. I was drinking apple juice in preparation for this race, and that was actually something that I drank and felt really good the morning of the race. It was adding about like 40 to 45 grams of carbs to my breakfast, which was great. And it also helped with hydration as well.
What about coffee? Coffee is one of those things that we've talked about before. I bring my coffee maker with me to a race because if I'm staying in a hotel, I want access to the coffee that I'm used to drinking. Did you guys bring your coffee maker? Did you rely on coffee from the hotel? What was your plan with that?
I also brought my coffee machine because we were driving, so it was possible. But something that we've grown accustomed to is drinking espresso. Having, a little bit of coffee or caffeine feels really good on my GI or my gut. I don't know if I would have been able to like drink a full 12 to 16 ounces of regular coffee. I think it would have thrown things off. It might have thrown off my appetite. It would have made me have to pee even more than I did.
I think that that's such a big thing, is like keeping that consistent, because if you aren't used to drinking that amount of volume from a caffeinated beverage, or potentially you're not used to that amount of caffeine, if you're drinking a different amount of caffeine than you normally do, that's something that can also really impact your day of race experience, because it's something, again, that's unfamiliar. So even though we might be thinking, oh, I usually have coffee in the morning, and then you end up drinking like this double caffeinated beverage than what you're used to, and all of a sudden your caffeine intake is so much higher, like that can really impact things way more than we think. So even like having a plan for that is such a strong and valuable thing to have in your kind of like plan for your race day that we often overlook. So I'm really glad that you guys had the forethought to bring what you're used to and even like keep the consistent amount the same, so that way you weren't having to pee as frequently. How did that go, by the way? I know that you guys picked your hotel because you wanted bathroom access before the race. Was that something that you were glad you had? Did that work out in your favor?
Yes. So it definitely worked out in our favor because I have the peas before my morning runs. And I also didn't realize like how many nerves I had. Like this was just a party pace race. Like there doesn't count for anything. We're just doing it for fun. Like again, I didn't finish the race, but before it, I have nerves and that makes me have to pee. I got really lucky because our hotel was like right next to the start line. And I remember like running into the bathroom 10 minutes before, quickly going to pee before jumping into my corral. But this is something that I'm going to focus on moving forward. And this is why, again, I didn't finish, but it was such a valuable experience because I might have not gotten the quote unquote peas, if I was just practicing a half marathon at my house. But because of that race day environment, it is something that came up.
I think so many runners experience this where we even think like this race is party pace. I'm not going to have any of that like adrenaline and nerves that I normally do. And then we're kind of surprised by the fact that like they still show up. So having even a plan for like, where am I going to the bathroom? When am I going going to the bathroom, when I'm going to have that happen. It's an important part of your race day strategy for sure, especially if you have a time-based goal. I think like one of the most important things that we often like forget when it comes to race day is that like your time chip doesn't start until you cross the start line. If you do have a time-based goal, prioritizing making sure that you use the restroom before you start, even if the race has started and you start in a corral that's a little bit further back, that's essentially going to put you further ahead than if you try to start the race with your corral and then need to stop mile 1, mile 2 in order to use the restroom, which is exactly what happened to me during my first marathon. So even having a plan for that and reminding yourself that like there is no pressure on you to get across the start line like with a specific corral or with a specific like group if you really need to use the bathroom.
I think that is such a good point because it's so easy to get like wrapped up in that race day, excitement, especially if you do have a time-based goal because they have pacers. And with the New York Marathon, for example, they have a pacer going off every 5 minutes and they have multiple pacers with, groups. And so I'm already stressed about like the pacer situation because it can be something that you just get really sucked into. And again, it doesn't matter. Like your time starts when your chip crosses the line.
Exactly. I think another kind of like interesting strategy is to stand in the line for the porta potties and do that well in advance. And then if the race hasn't started and if you have more time and have the flexibility, let the person from behind you go in front of you and just say, oh, you can go. Oh, you can go, but you're still at the front of the line. And then when you do need to go because you see you have 5 minutes before your group sends off, that's when you go. So you're at the front of the line, but you kind of wait until the last minute in order to use the restroom, which is also kind of a strategy that I've implemented before, which maybe it's a little controversial. I don't know, but it's just something that like has worked for me in the past when like those nerves and that time-based goal really is there.
That's a really good point. I thought about basically peeing and then just getting back in line.
That's another one that works too. Just lap it.
I'm also going to experiment a little bit with some like electrolyte timing. So especially the night before and the morning of, trying to figure out how I can maybe work on some of that fluid retention and just kind of manage it a little bit better. New York is going to be really interesting though, because I'm going to be waking up at 5:30, but I'm not going to be running until like 9:45, 10. So I'm wondering like how that's going to affect me differently.
And something that I'm sure that you will practice that time frame of like waking up that early, fueling throughout the morning, and then starting a long run later in the day just to see how your body handles it and reacts to that time frame.
Definitely, because I'm worried that maybe what is happening and what happened this last time is that I'm so worried about hydrating that I'm almost like overdoing it because I have limited time before the race since the time that I woke up.
Yep. And then we tend to overhydrate and then we need to pee and then our nerves make us need to pee even more. So definitely can be a thing. What about fueling during the race? How did that go for you?
It went really well. We ended up ending at mile 10, but before that I was feeling really well. If you have been following along on Instagram, I have been like trying out a gel situation. I don't really love a gel. I have started practicing with it a little bit, but I did use gummy bears to fuel for this half and I really like them. I mean, their majority are glucose based and that is a carbohydrate that we can absorb very readily through our gut and they work really well for me. It's going to be hard to carry the amount of gummy bears that I would need during a marathon, so I'm going to have to kind of experiment a little bit with that approach.
Yeah, get creative for sure. How do you do with chewing them while you're running? Do you slow down to chew them? Do you take just like one or two at a time? What does that look like for you? Because I know like a big thing that I've seen in running groups is that people have a hard time like chewing and running at the same time.
Yes. And I've also gotten DMs from people that are like, I tried to chew a gummy bear and I choked. So please be careful. I do think it is practice. And I also think that certain gummies and certain chews are better than others. I know like, for example, like a Mott's gummy is really hard to chew. So I don't ever recommend those. I have found with gummy bears with gels, I have to do a little bit at a time. Like even with taking a gel, I've noticed that I have to take like 4 or 5 like squeezes of it. And that's kind of the approach I take with gummy bears because I'll eat a couple of them at a time. I just like them. I don't know. I just like them a little bit more. I think it is a taste and texture thing, but I feel like because I've practiced so much with them, it is pretty easy for me to chew them.
Again, we're back to practicing and making sure that it's a familiar thing and that's what's worked for you because that's what you've trained with. So it totally makes sense. What about after the race? Even though you guys didn't make it all the way to 13, still really important to fuel what you did run. So how did that work out for you guys?
I was sharing this with you a little bit before we jumped on to record this, but I definitely did not prioritize fueling after the race the way that I usually do because we had to kind of navigate the streets of DC. My timeline was just off because I usually get my fuel in within 30 minutes, at least some type of liquid energy, and then I'm having a meal an hour and a half afterwards. But because our plan kind kind of got thrown off. I didn't end up fueling it for about 2 hours after the race. And I noticed that I was a lot more sore throughout the day, even though the run I had done previously the week before was similar in distance. I would say it was a little bit more of a challenging run. I just was really shocked how sore I was. And I think it might have been because I didn't prioritize my fueling.
It's so interesting to see how big of an impact that fueling can potentially make. And no fault to the runner in your group that was injured and needed to stop. But if you had made it to the full 13, there was probably a pretty good chance that they had some type of refuel option available for you. So even though the start and the stop line for your race weren't both at your hotel, having that option to refuel at the finish line, even if it's something that, maybe isn't your favorite thing to refuel with, you can start that refueling process. But because you were navigating the streets and trying to get back to your hotel and you weren't exactly at the finish line of the race, that prevented you guys from getting in fuel right away.
Definitely. And I think it's really important because oftentimes we think like once the race is over, like fueling doesn't matter. And especially if you're somebody who is training for multiple races or if you have a time-based goal, because I didn't fuel, I was more sore, right? And that's going to hinder like my future training and like how refreshed and refueled and ready to go I was during this week.
What other tips do you have for runners running half marathons, fueling for a half marathon that you really found valuable from your experience this past weekend?
I think one of the biggest things is we have to practice. You have to see what works best for you. For example, I do the gummy bears, but you might have tried gummy bears and you're like, I can't chew these. They taste horrible. I don't like them. So you have to practice that because we don't want you to have that experience on race day, especially if you have something that is time-based. I also, with the practice, would recommend practicing when you're not as stressed and maybe when the stakes are not as high, because then you can make mistakes and you can learn. I had a client tell me something that I really loved, and it's either like you win or you learn. So you're either being successful or you're learning from your failure. And I really thought that that applies so much to fueling as well.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
And then the second thing that I would recommend, making sure that you are eating enough leading up to your race. Something that I found a little challenging and just something that I just made a note of was because I was traveling the day before the race, I was out of my normal environment. So I had to be really mindful about making sure that I hydrated and making sure that I fueled, right? Packing enough snacks, packing enough water, packing enough electrolytes, because again, like I was in a car for 5.5 hours. So I needed to make sure that I had all of my fueling with me.
Which is something I think that's so easy to overlook, because if you are traveling a distance similar to that, you often think, oh, I'll just stop something and grab something along the way. But if that's something that you're not familiar with taking in the day before your long run, there's a potential for impact from that for sure. So packing your snacks, packing your meal potentially that you're having in the car to avoid any upset stomachs or to avoid any uncomfortable feeling because it's unfamiliar is such a huge thing to remember to do.
Definitely. We actually hit bad weather when we were in the car. It made it more challenging for us to potentially stop. And additionally, kind of mentioning what you just shared, I was not used to eating out as much. My sister's boyfriend actually made us this like amazing home cooked Italian meal before our race. But I remember like after the race and for the rest of that day and on Sunday, I felt so full because I was not used to eating out. If you're somebody who does a lot of home cooked meals, eating out, the day or a couple of days before your race could definitely affect how you feel and could affect your fueling choices.
Yep. So even though we talked a lot about like the things that you brought your fueling for the morning of the race, sometimes if you are staying in a unfamiliar place or you might have like limited access to kitchen equipment, you might need to cook like your dinner for the night before and have that prepped and ready to go, or have something that feels familiar, because like Reilly said, like if it's something that you aren't used to eating, it can impact how you're feeling. And then if you are feeling fuller than you normally feel, then that can make it even more difficult to fuel the morning of your race. So trying to keep everything as similar as possible to what your home schedule is like and what your home fueling is like is one of the best things that you can do to set yourself up for success when you're going to run a race in a unfamiliar city.
Exactly. You control what you can control and you prepare for what you can't.
Exactly. And never underestimate the power of a good peanut butter and jelly sandwich when you're in the car.
That's what I had for lunch the day before my race.
Going out to California, every single race, we've had peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
It's
just
boring
an
stuff.
underrated way to fuel.
It is. And you know what? They're pretty darn good.
They are.
Anything else that you want to share from your race or anything that you're looking forward to as phase 2 of your run a marathon in 2025 kind of comes to life?
I don't know. I'm just really excited. I mean, again, I learned a lot this past weekend and I'm excited to kind of just go into this new phase. And I don't know, marathon's going to be here before I know it.
I'm so excited for you. As Reilly has shared multiple times on this podcast, she's running the New York Marathon this coming year, which is so exciting. So my plan is to try to get out there to cheer Reilly on. Very excited for you. If you have questions for Reilly and I over running, over period recovery, or anything nutrition related, feel free to reach out to us. You can leave questions in the comments of this podcast, or you can find us online. You can find Reilly on Instagram at easy.sports.nutrition, and you can find me at jenna.fisher.nutrition. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Eat More Carbs podcast. Please make sure you rate, subscribe, and review. And as always, remember to eat more carbs.